I never thought I would be the kind of person writing one of these. You see them online all the time, these detailed accounts of lives imploding in real time, and you always think, that could never be me. You think you've built something solid. My husband, Mark, and I had been married for 3 years, and we had just bought our first real house together, a beautiful, slightly outdated mid-century modern in a quiet suburb just outside of Austin. We spent months painting the walls, picking out furniture, and talking about how this was the place where we would eventually start a family. It felt like the beginning of the rest of our lives. But looking back, the cracks were already there, hidden just beneath the fresh coat of paint. The trouble didn't start with a stranger or a secret dating app. It started with Vanessa. Vanessa was Mark's college girlfriend, the one that everyone in his friend group still talked about with a sort of reverent, hushed tone. They had broken up 5 years before I even met him, a supposedly amicable split because they wanted different things in life. Mark had always been completely transparent about her, or at least he made it seem that way. He told me they were just old friends now, part of the same extended social circle, and because I wanted to be the secure, modern wife, I accepted it. I even hung out with her a few times at group dinners.
She was beautiful in that effortless, high-maintenance way that always made me feel like I was wearing the wrong shoes or hadn't done my hair quite right. But she was always perfectly polite to me, which made my lingering insecurity feel entirely irrational. Then came December. We had been in the new house for about 3 months, and Mark was eager to host a massive New Year's Eve dinner party to show it off to our friends. He was handling the guest list, and I was handling the catering and decor. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch watching some mindless reality TV, he cleared his throat in that specific way he does when he's trying to sound casual about something he knows might cause a stir. He looked at his phone, then up at me and said, "Hey, so Vanessa's back in town for the holidays. She's actually engaged now to this guy named David. I was thinking it might be nice to invite them to the dinner. You know, a nice housewarming gesture." My stomach did a tiny, familiar flip, but I forced a smile. "Oh, she's engaged. That's great. Yeah, of course, invite them. The more the merrier." I figured having her fiancé there would change the dynamic completely. It meant she was moved on, completely settled, and whatever ancient history she shared with Mark was truly dead and buried. Mark looked visibly relieved, kissing my forehead and telling me I was the best. I went back to looking at centerpiece ideas on Pinterest, entirely unaware that the trap was already being set. In the weeks leading up to the party, Mark's behavior started to subtly shift. He was working late more often at his commercial real estate firm, which wasn't entirely unusual for the end of the quarter, but he was also incredibly protective of his phone. If it buzzed on the kitchen counter, he would practically lung across the room to grab it face down. When I asked him about a deal he was working on, his answers were clipped, vague, and defensive. "Just closing out the year, babe. It's stressful," he'd say, kissing my cheek before retreating to his home office. I tried to give him space. I told myself that the stress of the new mortgage and the holidays was just getting to him. The real shift happened 5 days before New Year's Eve. Mark had left his iPad on the kitchen island, and it was synced to his iMessage. I wasn't looking for anything, I swear. I was just wiping down the counters after making dinner when the screen lit up with a notification. It was a text from an unsaved number, but the preview text made my heart stop. "I can't stop thinking about last night in your car. Count down the days until NYE." My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to shake so violently that I dropped the sponge into the sink. I stared at the screen until it went dark. With a trembling finger, I tapped the glass to wake it up. I didn't know the passcode to his iPad. He had changed it recently. But just seeing that preview text was like a physical blow to the chest. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I stood there in our beautiful, brand new kitchen, surrounded by the expensive appliances we had picked out together, and felt the entire foundation of my life turn to quicksand. I didn't confront him right away. The shock was too paralyzing, and a small, desperate part of me wanted to believe there was some logical, innocent explanation. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was a joke. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, while Mark was in the shower, I did something I had never done in our entire relationship. I snooped.
I waited until he was thoroughly occupied. Then I picked up his phone from the nightstand. Luckily, he hadn't changed his phone passcode yet. It was still our wedding anniversary. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I unlocked it and opened his messages. I didn't have to look far. The unsaved number from the iPad was there, but on his phone, it was saved under the initials VR. Vanessa's maiden name was Rossi. I scrolled up, my eyes burning as I read through weeks of messages. It wasn't just a harmless flirtation. It was a full-blown, passionate affair that had been rekindled the moment she arrived back in Texas in late November. They had been meeting up at a boutique hotel downtown during his late nights at the office.
They laughed about how clueless I was. They talked about how the New Year's Eve party was going to be their perfect cover, a way to be in the same room together, to share glances and touches right under my nose, and under the nose of her fiancé, David. But the text that shattered me into a million pieces was one from just 3 days prior. Mark had written, "The house is perfect, Vanessa. I bought it with you in mind, honestly. Every time I look at the master bedroom, I just picture you in it. This dinner is just the start. We're going to figure out how to be together for real this year. I'm done pretending with her." I sat on the edge of our bed, the phone heavy in my hands, feeling a cold, hard numbness wash over me. The sorrow was instant, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. But right behind it, rising up like a tidal wave, was an incandescent, blinding rage. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had used our savings, our dreams, and our new home as a backdrop for his fantasy with his ex-girlfriend. He was planning to discard me like old trash after using me to build the perfect domestic stage. I looked at his reflection in the steamed-up bathroom glass as he turned off the water. I had about 30 seconds to make a choice. I could scream, throw the phone at him, pack my bags and leave. I could be the heartbroken, hysterical wife who walks away weeping. But as I heard him reach for the towel, something inside me snapped. A dark, calculated clarity took over. Walking away quietly wasn't going to be enough. He wanted a grand performance at our New Year's Eve dinner? Fine, I was going to give him a show he would never forget. I quickly locked the phone, placed it exactly where I had found it, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. When Mark came down a few minutes later, smelling of soap and smiling his handsome, lying smile, I was pouring myself a cup of coffee. I smiled back at him, my heart perfectly still, and asked him if he thought we should order the prime rib or the filet mignon for the party. "Filet mignon," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and pressing a kiss to my neck. "Only the best for our guests, right?" "Right," I whispered, staring past him at the calendar on the fridge. "Only the best." Over the next 48 hours, I became a ghost in my own life, playing the part of the doting, busy hostess while secretly executing a completely different plan. I didn't know David, Vanessa's fiancé. I had never met him, and Mark had purposely avoided giving me his contact info. But in the age of the internet, nobody is unfindable. It took me less than an hour on LinkedIn and Instagram to track him down. He was a corporate attorney based out of Chicago, a handsome, sharp-looking guy who, from his social media, looked absolutely head over heels in love with Vanessa. His profile pictures were all of the two of them, smiling on beaches, celebrating their engagement. He had no idea he was about to walk into a slaughterhouse. I found his work email and his personal cell phone number through a public records database. I sat in my car in a Target parking lot, my hands gripped tightly around the steering wheel, debating how to make first contact. I couldn't just call him out of the blue and sound like a crazy person. I needed to be precise. I needed proof. So using a burner app, I sent him a single text message. "David, you don't know me, but your fiancée Vanessa is having an affair with her ex, Mark. They are planning to use the New Year's Eve dinner party in Austin as a cover to be together. If you want the proof, reply to this number. I have the receipts." I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, my phone buzzed. "Who is this? Is this some kind of sick joke?" "It's not a joke," I replied, my fingers flying across the screen. "I am Mark's wife. I found the texts on his phone. They've been meeting at the Line Hotel downtown for weeks. I can send you screenshots right now, or you can come to the dinner party on December 31st and see it for yourself. But I think you deserve to know the truth before you marry her." A long pause followed. I could picture him sitting in an office somewhere in Chicago, his entire world tilting on its axis, just like mine had.
Then he replied, "Send the screenshots." I sent them, every single one I had taken from Mark's phone.
The graphic messages, the declarations of love, the planning of their secret trysts, and the message where Mark talked about bringing Vanessa into our new home. I watched the status bubble animate as he read them. When he finally responded, the tone of his text was completely different. It was cold, hollow, and utterly broken. "What's the address of the house?" I sent him our new address. Then I typed out my final instruction. "Don't tell Vanessa you know. Act completely normal. Fly into Austin for the party. Let them think they're getting away with it. Let's give them the audience they deserve." "I'll be there," David replied. With the alliance formed, the countdown to New Year's Eve truly began. Mark was entirely oblivious, continuing his late-night text sessions, completely unaware that his mistress's fiancé was now privy to every single word. Every time Mark smiled at me, every time he complimented my dress for the party, it just added fuel to the fire burning inside me. I wasn't sad anymore. The grief had been completely burned away, leaving only a cold, hard desire for total vindictiveness. They wanted to destroy my life in the dark? Fine. We were going to do this under the brightest lights possible. The days leading up to New Year's Eve felt like a fever dream. I moved through our house like a ghost, meticulously organizing wine glasses, polishing silverware, and confirming the catering order, all while carrying a secret that felt heavy enough to collapse the roof. Mark was in a fantastic mood. He was lighter, more attentive than he'd been in months, which was the most sickening part of it all. His guilt wasn't making him miserable, it was making him celebratory. He bought a ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne for the midnight toast, placing it prominently in the center of our wine fridge. Every time I looked at that bottle, I had to suppress a feral, mocking laugh. He thought we were toast, celebrating our new home and our future. He had no idea what we were actually going to be marking at midnight. David and I kept in touch through the burner app, our messages sparse but lethal. He had confirmed his flight details. He was landing in Austin on the morning of the 31st. Vanessa was already in town, staying with her parents in a wealthy enclave nearby, which gave her and Mark ample opportunity to squeeze in what they thought were their final, thrilling, forbidden encounters before the big night. On the afternoon of the 30th, Mark told me he had to run to the office to sign some final year and closing documents. I didn't even blink. I just smiled, adjusted his collar, and told him not to work too hard. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I checked his location on his shared iPad. He wasn't at his office. He was parked at a boutique coffee shop 3 blocks away from Vanessa's parents' neighborhood. I sat on our pristine white sofa, staring at the little glowing blue dot on the map, feeling absolutely nothing. The pain had completely crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. By the time the afternoon of New Year's Eve arrived, the house looked like a magazine spread. I had hired a high-end local caterer to handle a 4-course dinner. The dining table was set for 12 people, our closest friends from Mark's college days, a couple of my own close friends, and of course, the guests of honor. The floral arrangements were heavy with dark winter greens and white roses. It looked like a wedding reception, which was fitting considering it was going to be a funeral for 2 different relationships. Around 4 in the afternoon, Mark was upstairs getting dressed, and I was downstairs finalizing the bar setup. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from David. "I just checked into my hotel. I'm dressing now. Vanessa thinks I'm arriving right before dinner because of a delayed flight. She has no idea I've been in town since 9 a.m. I replied instantly, "Perfect. Arrive exactly at 7. That's when everyone else will be here. Let's make sure there's a full house." When Mark came downstairs, he looked incredibly handsome. He was wearing a tailored black suit, his hair perfectly styled, smelling of the expensive cologne I had bought him for his last birthday. He walked into the kitchen, took 2 glasses, and poured us each a small glass of white wine. He handed one to me, looking around the room with a sense of immense pride. "Babe, look at this place," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "We really did it. First year in the house, hosting the whole crew. You killed it with the decor. I'm so proud of us." I looked into his eyes, searching for even a flicker of hesitation, a shred of remorse or conflict. There was absolutely nothing. He was entirely comfortable living a double life. He could hold my hand and look at our beautiful home
while actively planning to move his mistress into my bed. It was a level of sociopathy that made my skin crawl. "Thanks, Mark," I said, raising my glass slightly. "It's definitely going to be a night to remember." "To new beginnings," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "To new beginnings," I echoed, taking a slow sip. The guests started arriving right at 6:30. First was Sarah and Todd, a married couple we'd known for years, followed by Mark's old roommate, Jason, and his girlfriend. The house quickly filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm, ambient jazz playlist I had selected. Mark was in his element, holding court in the living room, pouring heavy drinks, and giving tours of the house. I watched him guide our friends up the stairs to show off the master suite, knowing exactly what he had texted Vanessa about that specific room.
Every compliment our friends paid him felt like a coin being deposited into a bank account I was about to completely liquidate. At exactly 6:50, the doorbell rang. Mark was in the middle of a story, so he waved his hand. "I got it," he called out, jogging down the hallway toward the front door. I positioned myself near the entryway, holding a tray of appetizers, watching his back. He opened the door, and there stood Vanessa. She looked stunning, wearing a backless, emerald green silk dress that practically screamed for attention. She looked like a woman who knew she was walking into a room where she was deeply, desperately wanted. "Vanessa, you made it," Mark said, his voice rising a fraction of an octave. He stepped forward and gave her a hug that lasted just a second too long, his hand lingering on the bare skin of her back. "Happy New Year's Eve, Mark," she purred, pulling back and looking around the entryway. "Oh my God, the house is gorgeous. You did an incredible job." "Thanks. Come on in," he said, guiding her into the foyer. He looked past her, out toward the driveway. "Where's David? I thought his flight got in this afternoon." Vanessa waved her hand dismissively, stepping inside and kicking off her snow-dusted coat. His connecting flight out of O'Hare got delayed because of de-icing issues. He texted me saying he's taking an absolute corporate emergency call on the way from the airport.
He told me to come ahead and said he'd just Uber straight here around 7:15 or so. You know how lawyers are. Bummer, but glad he's still making it, Mark said, though he couldn't quite hide the flash of pure, unadulterated relief in his eyes. A delayed fiancé meant more time to play his dangerous game right in front of everyone. Vanessa turned and saw me standing there, her expression instantly smoothed into a warm, bright smile. "Oh, hi! Look at you! You look beautiful! This house is an absolute dream." "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth, polite, and entirely detached. "I'm so glad you could make it. Can I get you a drink? We have a signature blackberry bourbon cocktail or plenty of wine." "Oh, the bourbon sounds amazing," she said, smoothing down her green dress. As I walked toward the bar to get her drink, I watched Mark follow her with his eyes. He didn't even realize I was watching him. He was completely intoxicated by her presence, entirely confident that he was the smartest man in the world, pulling off the ultimate deception. 10 minutes later, the clock chimed 7. The atmosphere in the living room was loud and cheerful. Vanessa was sitting on our new velvet sofa, surrounded by Mark's college friends, laughing loudly at a joke someone had made. Mark was standing nearby, leaning against the fireplace mantel, his gaze locked onto her. The tension between them was palpable to anyone who knew what to look for. The brief, intense glances, the way he laughed a little too hard at everything she said, the subtle shift in his posture whenever she moved. Then the doorbell rang again. Mark frowned slightly, looking at his watch. "Wait, who's that? Everyone's already here." "Maybe it's David," Vanessa said, sitting up and looking toward the door. "He must have caught an earlier Uber." "I'll get it," I said loudly, stepping out of the kitchen before Mark could move. "Mark, why don't you make sure everyone's glasses are topped off for the first course? The caterers are about to serve." "Sure thing, babe," he said, turning back toward the bar. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. With every step, the cold numbness inside me solidified into iron. I reached the heavy mahogany front door, took a deep breath, and turned the lock. I opened it. David was standing on the porch. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit, looking every bit the high-powered Chicago attorney, but his face was deathly pale, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, a man holding a bomb. I looked at him, and without a word, I extended my hand. "Hi, David. I'm so glad you could make it to our home." He looked at me, taking a heavy breath, and nodded once. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice tight and raspy. "Let's go inside."
I stepped aside, letting David cross the threshold into the warmth of the foyer. As he walked past me, he paused, adjusting his tie with a hand that shook slightly before he balled it into a fist. I closed the heavy front door behind him, the click of the latch sounding like the final turn of a key in a lock. There was no going back now. "They're in the living room," I whispered, looking directly into his exhausted, angry eyes. "Everyone is gathered around. Follow my lead." David nodded, taking a deep, ragged breath that seemed to pull what little composure he had left back into his frame. "Lead the way," he muttered. I walked ahead of him, our footsteps muffled by the long wool runner in the hallway. As we approached the arched entryway of the living room, the wall of noise hit us. Laughter, the clink of ice against crystal, the smooth jazz playing from the speakers. Mark was standing by the bar, laughing with Jason, a fresh drink in his hand. Vanessa was still on the couch, leaning back, looking up at Todd with a brilliant, performative smile. "Look who made it," I announced, my voice cutting through the chatter with a bright, stage-ready cheerfulness. The room went instantly quiet as everyone turned toward the entryway. Vanessa's smile froze. Her eyes went wide, darting from David to me, then over to Mark. The color drained from her face so fast it looked like a special effect. Mark, who had been mid-sip, nearly choked on his drink. He set his glass down on the counter with a loud, clumsy thud, his gaze locking onto David with utter bewilderment. "David!" Vanessa stammered, scrambling to her feet, her green silk dress rustling loudly in the sudden silence. What are you doing here so early? You said your flight was delayed. You said you were taking a corporate call." David didn't move. He stood right beside me, his hands shoved deep into his suit pockets, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. "My flight wasn't delayed, Vanessa," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, carrying across the room with absolute clarity. "And I didn't take an Uber from the airport. I've been downtown since this morning." Mark cleared his throat, stepping out from behind the bar, his hands held out in a defensive, placating gesture. He was trying to play the diplomatic host, but I could see the sweat glistening on his forehead. "Hey, David, man, welcome. I'm Mark. Vanessa's told me a lot about you. Look, if there's a misunderstanding with the travel, don't worry about it. Let me get you a drink. We're just about to sit down for dinner." "Shut up, Mark," David said. It wasn't a shout, it was a command. The entire room went dead silent. Jason and Todd exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah lowered her wine glass, her eyes darting between all of us. The atmosphere in our beautiful new living room turned suffocatingly tense in an instant. "David, honey, you're embarrassing me," Vanessa hissed, walking toward him, her heels clicking rapidly. She reached out to grab his arm, her manicured fingers trembling. "What is wrong with you? Did you drink on the flight? We're at a dinner party." David violently jerked his arm away from her touch, stepping back. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice finally cracking with a sliver of the raw pain he'd been hiding. He looked at her like she was a monster. "Don't ever touch me again." "Mark, what the hell is going on here?" Jason asked from the corner, his voice tight with discomfort. "Is this a joke?" "It's no joke, Jason," I said, finally stepping forward into the center of the room. I looked around at our friends, the people who had toasted to our new home just an hour prior. Then I looked at my husband. Mark was staring at me, his eyes darting back and forth as the first wave of true panic began to set in. He was realizing that I wasn't acting like a surprised hostess. I was acting like a conductor. "What are you doing, babe?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped toward me. "Whatever this is, let's talk about it upstairs. We have guests, please." "Oh, we're not going upstairs, Mark," I said, smiling at him. It was the coldest smile I had ever given anyone in my life. "We're going to have our dinner. In fact, I think everyone should take a seat at the dining table." The caterers worked really hard on the first course, and I'd hate for it to go to waste before we get to the main event. "Are you out of your mind?" Vanessa snapped, her sophisticated facade completely shattering as desperation took over. She looked at Mark pleadingly. "Mark, do something. Your wife is having some kind of psychotic break." "Actually, Vanessa, I've never been saner," I said, walking slowly over to the dining room entryway. The table was glowing under the chandelier, the 12 place settings waiting perfectly. "David, please, take a seat, right next to Vanessa's spot." David walked past Vanessa without looking at her and pulled out a chair. sitting down with a rigid, terrifying posture. The rest of our friends stood frozen in the living room, completely paralyzed by the sheer toxicity of the room. "Guys, please, just sit down," I told our friends, my tone dropping the cheerful act and becoming flat, serious, and unyielding. "You've all known Mark and Vanessa for a long time. I think you'll want to be in the room for the rest of this conversation." Reluctantly, awkwardly, like people being forced to watch a train wreck at gunpoint, our friends began to shuffle into the dining room. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the scraping of chair legs against the hardwood floor. Mark remained standing at the head of the table, his face completely pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He looked at his phone on the sideboard, likely realizing he hadn't checked it in hours, realizing he was entirely trapped. Vanessa sat down next to David, her eyes darting around the room like a caged animal. She was trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but her breathing was ragged. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table from Mark. I looked down the long expanse of the beautifully decorated table, looking at the man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. The catering staff, sensing the absolute horror in the air, quietly set down the first course, a delicate butternut squash soup, and immediately retreated to the kitchen, shutting the door behind them. "Mark, why don't you sit down?" I asked softly. He didn't move. "Tell me what this is," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "This is a celebration," I said, reaching into my small evening clutch and pulling out my phone. I placed it face up on the table. "A celebration of our new house, the house you bought with Vanessa in mind, the house with the master bedroom you just couldn't wait to picture her in." Vanessa let out a sharp, audible gasp. Mark looked like he had been struck by lightning. He staggered back a half step, his hand gripping the back of an empty chair for support. "What?" Sarah whispered from across the table, her eyes flying wide open. "Mark, what?" "You see," I continued, looking around at our friends, "Mark and Vanessa have been incredibly busy since she got back to Texas in November. They've been spending a lot of quality time together. Not at the office closing deals, like Mark told me, but at the Line Hotel downtown. Isn't that right, Vanessa?" Vanessa didn't answer. She pulled her hands down from the table, burying her face in them, her shoulders starting to shake as she began to cry. "I didn't want to believe it at first," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of tears. I had cried all my tears in that Target parking lot. Now I was just executing a script. But Mark left his iPad out, and then I looked at his phone, and honestly, the details were just too vivid to keep to myself. I felt like it was unfair to host this beautiful New Year's Eve dinner without sharing the love. "Stop it," Mark begged, his voice cracking as he looked at his friends, his face burning with a deep, pathetic shame. "Please, stop." "Stop?" David spoke up, his voice booming through the dining room, making everyone flinch. He leaned forward, staring directly at Mark. "You didn't want to stop when you were texting my fiancé about how much you despised your wife. You didn't want to stop when you were planning to use this exact party as a cover to hook up with her in the guest room while we were all downstairs eating your food." David reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. He threw them onto the center of the table. They scattered across the pristine white tablecloth, sliding into the bowls of soup. They were the screenshots, the graphic, undeniable evidence of their betrayal, printed out in stark black and white for everyone to see. "Go ahead, guys," I said to our horrified friends. "Take a look. Pass them around. Let's count down to the new year together." "Do you want me to generate the next part?" Nobody reached for the papers. They just sat there, soaking up the orange butternut squash soup on our expensive tablecloth, the ink bleeding into the fabric. Jason looked down at the sheet closest to him, his eyes scanning a few lines before he threw his head back and stared at the ceiling, letting out a heavy, disgusted breath. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling up in her eyes, as she looked at me, then at Mark. "Is this true, Mark?" Todd asked, his voice dead and heavy. He was Mark's best man at our wedding. He looked like he had just been handed a death sentence. "Look at me. Is this real?" Mark couldn't look him in the eye. He looked down at the floor, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the chair. He didn't say a word, which was all the answer anyone in that room needed. His silence was deafening. It filled the room like smoke, suffocating whatever remnants of friendship and loyalty had existed just minutes before. Vanessa was sobbing openly now, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "David, please," she whimpered, her voice muffled. "Please, let's just leave. Let's go back to the hotel. We can talk about this. I can explain. Please." David finally turned his head to look at her. The utter contempt in his eyes was staggering. "There is no we, Vanessa," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut sharper than a razor. "I've already called my attorney. The wedding is off. Your parents are going to get a call from me tomorrow morning exactly why I'm returning the ring. You can stay in Austin. You can have him." He pointed a trembling, angry finger at Mark. "Because after tonight, he's all you've got left." With that, David stood up. He didn't look at Mark. He didn't look at our friends. He looked down the length of the table at me, gave a single solemn nod of his head, and walked out of the dining room. A few seconds later, we heard the heavy thud of the front door closing behind him. The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Vanessa slowly lifted her head from her hands. Her makeup was completely ruined, black mascara running down her pale cheeks, her expensive green silk dress looking wrinkled and pathetic. She looked around the table, realizing that every single person in that room, people she had known for nearly a decade, people who used to adore her, was looking at her with a mixture of horror and profound disgust. "You did this," Vanessa whispered, her tear-stained face twisting into a mask of pure hatred as she locked her eyes onto me. "You twisted psycho bitch. You brought everyone here just to do this?" "I didn't do anything, Vanessa," I said, my voice completely flat and calm. I picked up my wine glass, took a small sip, and set it back down. "You and Mark wrote the script. I just provided the audience. You want it to be in this house so badly? You want it to be in our lives? Well, here you are. Take a look around." Vanessa scrambled out of her chair, nearly knocking it over. She grabbed her designer clutch from the table, not even bothering to pick up her coat from the hallway, and ran out of the room. We heard her heels frantically clicking down the hallway, followed by the front door opening and slamming shut for the second time that night. Then there were 10 of us left. Mark slowly raised his head. The arrogance, the smug satisfaction, the handsome charm, it was all completely gone. He looked completely broken, hollowed out by the sheer public weight of his own actions. He looked at Jason, then at Todd, his oldest friends in the world. "Guys," Mark started, his voice cracking. I made a mistake. It's not what it looks like."
Todd stood up so fast, his chair screeched against the floor. "Don't, Mark," he said, his voice shaking with a dangerous level of anger. "Don't say another word to me. You sat there at the bar 20 minutes ago, bragging to me about your equity in this house. You looked your wife in the eye and told her you loved her while you had that woman's text messages on your phone. You're a liar, man. I don't even know who the hell you are." Todd reached over, grabbed Sarah's hand, and pulled her up. "We're leaving," he told the room. Within 2 minutes, the mass exodus began. Jason and his girlfriend stood up next, followed by the rest of our friends. Nobody said goodbye to Mark. A few of them walked over to my end of the table, offering tight, tearful hugs and whispering things like, "I'm so sorry," and "call me if you need anything," before slipping out into the cold December night. I thanked them politely, my voice steady, acting like a normal hostess seeing her guests out after a perfectly pleasant evening. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, the house went completely dark and quiet, save for the ambient jazz playlist still humming softly from the living room speakers. I stood at the end of the dining table, looking at the mess. The cold bowls of soup, the scattered, soup-stained screenshots of my husband's infidelity, the expensive wine glasses half filled. Mark was still standing at the other end of the table, his head buried in his hands. "Are you happy?" he finally whispered, lifting his face. His eyes were red, his face haggard. "You ruined everything. You destroyed my life. You destroyed my reputation. My friends won't even look at me. Are you happy?" I walked slowly down the side of the table, stopping just a few feet away from him. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my entire future, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a vast, empty peace. I didn't destroy your life, Mark, I said softly, my voice echoing in the empty, beautiful room. You did that the second you decided that my love, my loyalty, and our marriage weren't enough for you. You wanted Vanessa? You can have her. But you won't have this house. You won't have my savings. And you will never, ever see my face again. I turned around, walked up the stairs to our master bedroom, and locked the door behind me. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed he had pictured his mistress in, and watched the clock on the nightstand click over to midnight. Down in the distance, somewhere in the neighborhood, I could hear the faint sound of fireworks popping, celebrating the arrival of the new year. I took a deep, clean breath, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs for the first time in weeks. The old life was dead, buried under the weight of a single, unforgettable dinner. But as I looked out the window at the dark Texas sky, I realized something important. The new year had officially started, and for the first time in a very long time, I was completely free.